At 03:47 local time on a Tuesday in late March, a single container vessel runs aground in the Strait of Hormuz, blocking one of the two navigable channels through the narrow waterway. Within 6 hours, 21 tankers carrying roughly one-fifth of the world's petroleum liquids are forced to slow, reroute, or idle in the Persian Gulf. Within 12 hours, the price of crude on global markets spikes. Within 24 hours, the first fuel shortages appear at coastal depots in South Asia and East Africa. By the second day, trucking fleets that depend on diesel begin to idle. By the third day, supermarkets in cities thousands of miles from the blockage start to look different. This is not a hypothetical scenario. This is a plausible outcome of a single disruption at a single choke point, and it reveals something that most people never think about. The global economy runs on a razor-thin inventory model where most nations hold fewer than 3 days of essential goods, and the entire system is routed through a handful of geographic corridors that can be blocked by a single vessel, a single missile, or a single geopolitical decision. The mainstream narrative treats supply chain disruptions as infrastructure problems, broken ships, blocked canals, bad luck that passes with time. But the real issue is structural. Modern economies were built on just-in-time delivery networks designed to eliminate waste, reduce costs, and maximize efficiency by shipping components across borders daily with virtually no strategic buffer. The assumption that someone will fix the problem quickly ignores the cascading failure logic that operates beneath the surface. Fuel shortages stop trucks. Trucks stop hospitals. Hospitals stop water treatment. Water treatment stops everything. The 3-day window is not a survivalist's talking point. It is an engineering reality of lean logistics, and it applies to every major economy on the planet. When the supply chain freezes, the freeze does not announce itself with a warning. It arrives as empty shelves, then closed gas stations, then darkened hospital wings, then a quiet that feels unlike any ordinary power outage because it is not about electricity. It is about the absence of the invisible systems that deliver the raw materials of daily life. The global economy was not designed to withstand this kind of fracture, and it was not designed by accident. The optimization that created this fragility was incentivized by financial structures that reward low inventory and penalize buffer. Tax codes, shareholder expectations, and trade agreements all pushed manufacturers and retailers to hold less, ship faster, and accept the risk that any single point of failure could cascade into a systemic collapse. The result is a world where the average grocery store carries roughly 3 days of inventory, where global semiconductor fabrication depends on raw materials sourced from at least 15 countries across 4 continents, and where the failure of a single waterway can ripple through supply networks that touch every continent within 72 hours. This is the operating condition of modern civilization, and it has been this way for decades. The question is not whether the next disruption will come. The question is whether the systems in place can absorb it, and what happens in the space between the first broken link and the first empty shelf. The space between the first broken link and the first empty shelf is where geopolitics becomes personal, and it is governed by corridors that most people never see. Roughly 80% of global trade by volume moves by sea, and the majority of that passes through a small number of narrow straits, canals, and maritime corridors that can be physically blocked or militarily contested by a single decision. The Strait of Hormuz handles roughly 21% of global petroleum liquids, with 21 tankers passing through daily. The Suez Canal carries about 12% of all global trade, and when the Ever Given ran aground there in March of 2021, the estimated cost of delayed goods reached $9.6 billion per day. The Malacca Strait moves about 25% of global maritime trade, including roughly 60% of China's oil imports. The Taiwan Strait sees 100 million tons of cargo annually, and a blockade there would sever the semiconductor supply chains that power everything from smartphones to missile guidance systems. The Panama Canal handles about 5% of global trade, and drought-driven water levels in 2023 and 2024 forced daily transit slots down from 36% to as few as 24%. The material reality of modern life passes every single day, and they have been sites of colonial conquest and naval warfare for centuries. The geography has not changed, only the cargo has. The reason these choke points carry so much weight is that the global economy was deliberately optimized to be fragile. After World War II, economic thinking shifted toward lean models that minimize inventory, ship components across borders daily, and eliminate what was considered waste. This approach reduced costs and lowered consumer prices, but it also eliminated the strategic buffer that would allow any system to absorb a shock. The average grocery store in the United States holds roughly 3 days of inventory, and many European retailers hold less than 2%. Global semiconductor fabrication depends on raw materials sourced from at least 15 countries across 4 continents. The United States Strategic National Stockpile was designed for 90-day national emergencies, but repeated deployments during pandemics and disasters have depleted it far below its designed capacity. Just-in-time delivery accounts for an estimated 15 to 25% reduction in inventory costs, but it creates a single point of failure dependency on continuous transport that has no precedent in human history. This fragility was not a logistical oversight. It was incentivized by tax structures and shareholder pressure that penalize holding inventory, meaning the brittleness of the system is a feature of the financial architecture itself. And that is precisely what makes supply chains a weapon. Major powers have learned that controlling the flow of goods is more strategically powerful than controlling territory. Sanctions, export controls, and route blockages can cripple an adversary without firing a single shot. Russia's blockade of Ukrainian grain exports between 2022 and 2024 affected more than 50 countries dependent on Ukrainian wheat, corn, and sunflower oil, triggering food inflation across Africa and the Middle East. China's dominance in rare earth minerals, supplying about 60% of global raw rare earths and 90% of processing, gives it leverage over electronics, defense, and green energy supply chains worldwide. The United States export controls on advanced semiconductors to China, first imposed in October 2022 and updated repeatedly since, targeted the supply chain directly rather than military assets. The Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping in late 2023 forced major carriers to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 10 to 14 days and more than $1 million per voyage in fuel costs. The European Union's Critical Raw Materials Act of 2024 explicitly identifies supply chain vulnerability as a national security threat, not merely an economic one. The nations most vocal about free trade and open supply chains are simultaneously the ones building the largest strategic reserves and diversifying their sourcing away from rivals, a contradiction that reveals the true priority beneath the rhetoric. This is not a new pattern. History is filled with moments when supply chain collapse preceded the fall of empires and the destabilization of entire regions. The Berlin blockade of 1948 cut off all land and water routes to West Berlin, forcing a 15-month airlift that delivered 2.3 million tons of supplies, the only alternative to surrender. Japan's surrender in the Second World War was accelerated by the American submarine campaign that sank approximately 5 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping, starving the home front of fuel and food. The 1973 OPEC oil embargo triggered a global recession within months, proving that energy supply chain disruption could reshape geopolitics overnight. Venezuela's economic collapse, ongoing since 2014, was accelerated not just by sanctions but by the breakdown of its domestic supply chain, with food and medicine imports dropping roughly 70% between 2014 and 2019. And the Soviet Union's inability to feed itself through its centralized supply chain was a structural factor in its dissolution, not merely a political one. In every case, the society with the shortest buffer, the leanest and most optimized system, collapsed fastest when the supply chain broke. The same logic that lowers consumer prices also means that a disruption on one continent can freeze daily life on another within 72 hours, and geography has not stopped mattering. It has simply been hidden inside container ships and semiconductor wafers, waiting for the moment when someone decides to pull the thread. And so the thread is pulled and the world feels the tug. The opening map, the stalled vessel, the 72-hour countdown, these were not presented as a distant warning. They were presented as the permanent operating condition of the global economy. The 3-day window is not an emergency preparedness tip. It is the baseline reality of how the world now functions, and it has been this way for longer than most people have been alive. This is the condition that governs every shipment, every delivery, and every restock on which daily life depends. The contrast between what most people assumed and what is actually true is worth sitting with for a moment. The dominant understanding of supply chain disruption is that it is a temporary inconvenience, a delayed package, an empty shelf for a week, a news segment that resolves itself before the next broadcast. But the structural reality is entirely different. The global economy is a single, interlinked organism with no redundancy, routed through corridors that can be closed by a single actor's decision. When that corridor closes, there is no backup route that can absorb the volume in time. There is no reserve stockpile waiting in a warehouse. There is only the next ship, the next truck, the next container, and the next day's schedule. This is the deeper lesson that globalization delivered, and it is not the one most people celebrate. Globalization did not make the world more resilient, it made the world more efficient. And efficiency and resilience are structural opposites. The same just-in-time logic that lowers consumer prices also means that a disruption on one continent can freeze daily life on another within 72 hours. The cheap goods on the shelves are not a sign of abundance, they are a sign of optimization. And optimization has no margin for error. Geography has not stopped mattering. It has simply been hidden inside container ships and semiconductor wafers, rendered invisible by the speed and scale of modern trade. But the maps have not changed. The choke points are still where they were. The straits are still where they were. The nations that control those corridors still hold the same structural power they held a century ago. The only difference is that now the cargo includes microchips and medical components instead of coal and spices, but the geography of vulnerability remains identical. The feeling that should remain after understanding all of this is not alarm. It is informed unease. This understanding should not be a call to stockpile supplies, but a permanent shift in how the news is read. Every headline about a blocked canal, a sanctioned nation, a seized port, or a trade war is not just an economic story. It is a story about the fragility of the system that delivers the material conditions of daily life. The next disruption is not a question of if, it is a question of when, and it will arrive without warning, without drama, and without a single shot fired. The shelves will thin, the fuel pumps will run dry, the hospitals will feel it first, and by the third day, the world will look very different from the one it was on the morning of the first day.